So, with the 150th birthday of Lenin, I wanted to take some time to address some of the common criticisms that I've been hearing about him and show how most of these arguments are either misled or just blatantly false. So, with this, I'm going to be referencing a video made by Zoomer Nation called The Truth about Vladimir Lenin, which expresses some of the common arguments. And if you want to check the video out for yourself, I'll of course leave a link of that in the description. But the first main argument that Zoomer Nation brings up is that the main problem with Leninism is apparently vanguardism. Now, apparently, Lenin doesn't understand how power works, and that the Vanguard Party is ultimately oppressive and above the working class in power. Not a dictatorship of the proletariat, but a dictatorship of the state. So, in order to address this first set of arguments, we have to talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat. So, when Marxists talk about the state, we're talking about the state as a product of the class struggle. The state is the instrument by which the bourgeois suppresses the proletariat. And so, to discuss the nature of the state without taking into account its class nature is to ignore reality. But this is something that anarchists do all the time. Marxists call the current capitalist paradigm, the one that we live in right now, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. This is a state where the ruling bourgeois minority class oppresses the subordinate proletariat majority class. They contrast this with the dictatorship of the proletariat, a society where the proletariat majority wields state power against the bourgeois minority. But to an anarchist, the state must be opposed, even a state where the proletariat are in control. And this is absolutely absurd. I mean, to destroy the bourgeois as a class, it becomes necessary to destroy the bourgeois state. That much we agree on. But it's also equally important to build a new proletarian state from the ashes, to guide and lead society against the counter-revolutionary forces that remain. And the whole idea that the class struggle is over once the bourgeois state has been smashed is childish. Obviously, the bourgeois will try to stoke the flames of counter-revolution, and the international bourgeoisie will try imperialism to weaken the country both from within and abroad. So, how do the proletariat protect themselves? How do they coordinate the economy? And on what ideological basis is the proletariat organized? It becomes obvious to anybody who's tried to organize in real life that there needs to be a certain unifying and guiding ideology or methodology to get work done. You all have to be on the same page. I mean, if too much time is spent wondering if capitalism is really all that bad, that actually leaves less time to discuss what to actually do about capitalism. If too much time is spent wondering if all state power, even a dictatorship of the proletariat, is oppressive, that leaves less time to actually plan how to build a dictatorship of the proletariat. So, in other words, it becomes necessary for the people who believe in a communist revolution to come together and form some kind of an organization, a party. Now, what separates a Leninist vanguard party from other revolutionary organizations is that it's run by democratic centralism. This is a policy of universal adherence to the party line. Now, that's not to say that dissenting opinions aren't tolerated, far from it. Such a party formation would encourage debate and discussion throughout the decision-making process. But the important thing is, once a measure is passed, it can only be readdressed through official party channels. This prevents factions from forming within the party and keeps it on the right ideological track. It was the discipline of the Bolsheviks, combined with their theoretical knowledge about the nature of the class struggle and Lenin's overall strategy for building a vanguard, that enabled the Bolsheviks to establish the first lasting socialist state. Now, there seems to be this notion among anarchists that the vanguard party is somehow separate from the proletariat. Now, such an interpretation, once again, it ignores the class nature of the state. The vanguard party, ladies and gentlemen, it is a tool. It's a sword by which the proletariat uses to slay the capitalist dragon. The vanguard consists of the proletariat, not separate from the proletariat. In fact, it's the most revolutionary segment of the proletariat, those who clearly understand the class nature of society and the lines of march. In other words, the communists. I mean, would it make sense to allow capitalists into the vanguard party of the proletariat? Not at all. So, what exactly are the anarchists complaining about here when they complain about the vanguard party? They've somehow convinced themselves that the communists, those who fought and died to free their fellow proletariat comrades from bondage, suddenly turn on their fellow proletariats and become a new class in and of themselves. This obviously makes no sense when you consider the class nature of the state. I mean, after all, it's a dictatorship of the proletariat, a society in which the proletariat rule. So, what is exactly the anarchist solution to this? I mean, most often you hear them talk about factory councils, but those also go by another name, Soviets. Where have I heard that name before? But anarchists frequently argue that a decentralized model of proletarian power is somehow more free and less oppressive than the Leninist approach. Now, how did that work out in practice? I mean, the CNT in Catalonia had concentration camps, enforced conscription. Makhno's Ukraine had anti-Jewish pogroms and chain gangs. But hey, that sounds pretty anarchistic to me. So going back to the whole decentralized council thing, what happens when one of these workers' councils gets overrun by capitalist or by opportunist? Do the other councils band together and suppress the counter-revolution? That sounds pretty authoritarian to me. I mean, what if two councils get involved in a dispute? Who adjudicates between them? Looks like you'd need some form of a central authority to defer to. Now, what happens when capitalist countries start to send armies across the borders to reclaim their private property? Looks like you'll also need borders and someone to guard them. And speaking of armies, how are these decentralized councils going to produce a well-equipped modern military? Again, what if one of the councils won't cooperate and the whole supply chain is fucked up? I mean, what do you do about counter-revolutionary spies? About saboteurs or infiltrators? How do the factory councils prevent themselves from being infiltrated? All of these are problems which any anarchist society would face immediately, and the solutions would be to create something resembling the dictatorship of the proletariat, although the anarchists would play the name game and call it something else. Instead of a state, they would call it an organized zone of workers' control. Instead of an army, they'd call it a People's Defense Force. But the end result is the same. They've just built a shittier, decentralized form of the dictatorship of the proletariat that is sure to crumble into dust. Rather than use the vanguard party to establish a stable framework for the revolution and the building of a proletarian state, they seem to think that the masses will somehow magically reach an even more enlightened level of theoretical understanding than a dedicated vanguard party. That all of the workers will be committed revolutionaries for the communist cause, and that literally none of them would harbor petty bourgeois sentiments. This is the level of childishness and idealism we deal with when talking to anarchists. So, in the second part of the video, Zero Nation says that Leninists act like the goal of the socialist revolution is to preserve power. And this is why we praise the USSR, because they're powerful. Now, to that, I say this. Now, if that's true, then why do the anarchists always find themselves allying with the disenfranchised, with the poor, with the downtrodden, with the oppressed? If we loved power so much, then why aren't we allying with the powerful? Why aren't we siding with the bourgeois? If your whole claim is that we want power, well, that's only half true. We want people's power. We want proletarian power. And that's actually a good thing. You should want that too, Zoomer Nation. So I don't really understand what the argument is here. Um, you also say that the NEP, the new economic policy, proved that the USSR wasn't socialist. Okay, so to talk about the new economic policy, we have to talk about the state of the USSR during the early 1920s. Now, the Russian Civil War lasted from 1918 to 1922. So the country, in addition to suffering in World War I, in addition to the revolution, they were also going through a devastating civil war. And the new economic policy was deemed necessary by the Soviet government to foster economic growth in the largely backwards and war ravaged countryside. Now, this was a period, just to explain what it is, this was a period of limited free markets and capitalism, all under the direct control of the proletarian state. And I really want to stress that word limited. Now, keep in mind that no capitalist actually commanded state power during this time, so it in no way resembled traditional state capitalism. In order to see the distinction, consider how the U.S. military purchases fighter jets from private capitalist companies like Boeing. This is an example of capitalism being used for state purposes. But unlike the USSR, the U.S. government is controlled by the bourgeoisie rather than the Communist Party. During the new economic policies, major industries as well as the banks were all still controlled by the state, which was controlled by the proletariat. So the new economic policy was not an abandonment of socialism, it was a small step in building socialism. And it only lasted for a total of 8 years before Stalin abandoned it anyway in 1928, favoring collectivization and rapid industrialization efforts. So to say that the new economic policy represented the typical economic policy of the USSR is greatly misleading. The new economic policy was always considered a temporary measure by Lenin, and the USSR abandoned it after 8 years. So, to wind it down, one of the last claims that Zoomer Nation makes in their video is that tankies believe in degeneracy theory, or we largely believe in degeneracy theory. Now, this, last claim I find particularly offensive as a tanky, because as a tanky, I have never seen myself or any other tanky profess belief in degeneracy theory, or even say casually, oh, this is degenerate or that's degenerate. That is something that Nazis do. Belief in degeneracy theory is a Nazi belief. It's something that social Darwinists believe, not Marxist-Leninists. So the fact that Zoomer Nation is claiming Marxist-Leninists believe in degeneracy theory is not unlike the claim that tankies are Nazis, which is a takeaway that I find equally offensive and shallow, but also equally common amongst anarchists. Now, I don't know what tankies Zoomer Nation has spoken to in the past, or if they were actually tankies or not. But let me just say this for the record. I despise transphobia, homophobia, and all other forms of bigotry. The party that I'm a member of, the PCUSA, has an entire commission dedicated towards LGBT people. They also have commissions for people of color, for women, etc. So, I'm tired of all these anarchists going around saying Marxist-Leninists don't like trans people. Marxist-Leninists don't like minorities. Give me a break. I'm so tired of explaining to anarchists that communists are not, in fact, Nazis, and that we actually do support LGBT people. If you go around claiming otherwise, you're being a reactionary. So all that is to say, happy 150th birthday, Lenin. I wish that we could clone your body and bring you back, because the world sure needs more folks like Lenin right now. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Do you like Lenin? Because you should. If you're a communist, you should definitely like Lenin. So yeah, let me know what you think.